board and then admit everyone. Yep. You're coming in. So we're expecting around 100 people maximum. Normally we get to, so but maximum 100, we can only do 100 maximum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Islamic Courses session titled Book Review Discussion, Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology. Very honored and privileged to have the author, Professor Frank Griffel from the Yale University in US of A. It's hosted by Imran Iqbal from Whitethread Institute, whitethreadinstitute.org, which is in the UK. Before I hand it over to Imran, can I just remind everyone, please keep your devices on silent. It is being recorded, so if you're not on our mailing list, leave your email on the chat. And there is a Q&A session. But we'll tell you where the Q&A session is. So without further ado, welcome, Professor, and I'll hand it over to Imran. Bismillah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mizan, for the opportunity. First and foremost, we're very fortunate today to have Professor Frank Griffel, leading researcher in Islamic theology and philosophy in the academy.
Imran, your camera's gone.
Oh, sorry. Can you see me now?
Mm-hmm.
Apologies. So again, as I was saying, we're very fortunate to have Professor Griffel today, a leading academic in terms of Ghazalian studies, someone who's actually produced numerous articles, as well as his major work, Al-GHAZALI'S Philosophical Theology, which is under review today, and the professor will go through that particular work. He's not only produced lots of works and articles on Al-Ghazali, he's produced works on other eminent thinkers, for example, Razi. He's got new articles on Maimonides, he's got articles on Al-Farabi, Ibn Taymiyyah comes in as well. So the professor is, very well appreciative of the contours of Islamic theology and philosophy in terms of a diachronic sense. And moreover, not only is he, medieval in terms of studying medieval theologians and philosophers, he's also written quite extensively about modern issues. So he's got really interesting articles about, what is Salafism. He's got articles about the nature of Islam. He's got one in German about a new essay about Islam. I'm not sure that's going to be translated. Maybe the professor can mention that to us later. So he's got lots of really, really interesting articles. He's edited a number of interesting works, translated a number of interesting works into German from Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali. So we're very fortunate to have Professor today come and spend some time with us, go through his monograph, Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology, which is, I would say, very, very well received in academic circles, won prizes. You had eminent, thinkers such as Robert Winosky, John Hoover, Julius Johansen praise the work. So this is a bona fide work within our field. And we're very fortunate to have Professor go through this work today, his findings, his research, and his major argument, the backdrop of the argument, and then hopefully he will, give us some trajectories in regards to how this work informs his forthcoming work that's coming in the summer, which we're very excited about in terms of, post-classical Islam and philosophy. So I'll pass it to the professor, and he'll do his presentation for about half an hour or so. And then after that, we have an open Q&A where you can ask the professor further questions for elaboration, clarification, and just extra, trajectories. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mizan and Imran, and thank you, Islamic Circles, for the interest that you have in my work, and for extending the invitation here. And here at home in New Haven, in my office, we have a sunny day outside, but I'm very glad to join you over Zoom. And I'm here to talk about my book. So this is, some of you might have seen it, Al-GHAZALI'S Philosophical Theology. It came out in 2009. Which is more than 10 years ago. I've since been working on something similar, a little bit different, and we might talk about that in the Q&A. But what I want to do in the next half hour or so, I want to talk about what motivates me to write that book and what I try to achieve. I should probably start very briefly. I don't want to talk much about my personality and my background. But some of you might know that I grew up in Germany from, I would say, circles. My family was not very much close to university education. None in my family ever had gone to university before I went. I was very fortunate to benefit from a number of, I would say, programs and promotions that wanted to get, in a sense, people like me, in this case, who come from, I grew up in the countryside, really on a village, to get them involved into university education. I'm very grateful for that. For one reason or the other, I started to take a class in Arabic. Now, the reason or the other was that I was very interested in traveling in those days. And I had already done a trip where I went when I was a teenager from Germany. I basically took a bus to Istanbul, which was very easy in those days. And from Istanbul on, I went on to the whole, to much of the Middle East. Then I went to Egypt. My trip ended in Aswan. I actually wanted to go to Sudan, but never got there. And then I slowly returned. And on that way, I had already learned some Arabic. And this was before I went to university. When I then finally went to university, I thought, well, you had done, some Arabic, you find it interesting, and why don't you actually take a class in Arabic? And that was at the University of Göttingen. There was daily classes, started at 8:30 in the morning. I've always been an early riser, and it suited me. I actually stayed in the class. My teacher was somebody who's still in my field today. It's Ulrich Rudolph, who then was somebody who taught at Göttingen and is now at Zurich University, also working in the field of falsafa and Islamic intellectual history. But my real studies were actually in philosophy. I was doing just Arabic by the side. And at one point I decided, why don't you actually, do serious studies in Arabic literature and what we call in German Islamwissenschaften, that is Islamic studies. And so that's actually what I ended up after a couple of years. It was the old academic system in Germany. There was no division between BAs and MAs. You just went to university, you did whatever you wanted. There weren't even records of what you did. And I ended up with a strong interest in Arabic and Islamic philosophy. However, I should say I also had a parallel interest in other fields. And one of them was, for instance, West African history. And at one point, after I think 6 years of studying, I reached a crisis. I dropped out. I went away from my studies to another place and did my civil service then, which was in lieu of the military service. And there, in that place, which was really one of the backdrops of Germany, I actually came across the book of Richard M. Frank. He had published it in German. Not in German, in Germany. It was printed in English. This is Creation of the Cosmic System. And it was one of the few books in that place in Islamic studies. And it's a very short book. It has 70 pages, but it's extremely challenging. If you ever take it, it's hard to read. I started reading it and I was from the beginning, I was fascinated. It took me a long time to understand what was going on there, but I realized something important was going on. From that moment on, I was basically hooked on the field of Ghazali studies. Now, what Richard M. Frank does here in this book, he tries to show, and that goes, at that point, went against the grain of anybody who was thinking about Al-Ghazali at that time. He tries to show that Al-Ghazali, in fact, was heavily influenced by the philosophy of Avicenna, Ibn Sina. By that point in time, if you actually open any book on Al-Ghazali, you actually would hear, about strong enmity between Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Ghazali. And that Al-Ghazali is the destroyer of, or was the destroyer of philosophy, and that he hated the philosophers, and that he wanted them to be killed, and similar things. Now, some of them is actually true, and that actually led to the, I would say, explosiveness of the work that Richard M. Frank presents here. That in fact Al-Ghazali was heavily polemicizing against what he calls the Falasifa, which is the school of Avicenna. Yet at the same time, there were also strong influences of Avicenna on the thought of Al-Ghazali, and that interested me. So I went into this field. I wanted to write my master thesis first on West African history, and then I switched to Al-Ghazali. I eventually wrote my master thesis on Al-Ghazali's Faisal al-Tafriqa, which I then later also translated into German. And I became interested, first of all, in this question about apostasy. Al-Ghazali's fatwa at the end of his Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he declares that anybody who subscribes to three particular teachings, that is the eternity of the world, God's ignorance of individuals, and the denial of bodily resurrection in the afterlife, whoever subscribes to these three positions is an unbeliever, a kafir. In his eyes, also a murtad, an apostate who can actually be killed. That is Al-Ghazali's view. I wrote about that in my dissertation, and then I returned to this question that Richard M. Frank actually put out here. I didn't write much about that in my master thesis, and neither in my dissertation, but I returned to this question. And by this point in time, it was clear that Richard M. Frank also had, there were people in this case who rejected his ideas. Most importantly was somebody whom I met briefly right after I finished my dissertation. That was Michael Mamura, who was teaching at Toronto University. Richard M. Frank taught in Washington at the Catholic University. And both of them, I only met very briefly on one occasion, each one of them on one occasion only. And, we just had a conversation no longer than half an hour. But I know, and I knew their work very well. And let me just briefly talk about the conflict between the views of Richard M. Frank and Michael Mamura. So Richard M. Frank, by basically rereading Al-Ghazali, he was a master in command of classical Arabic. He had worked on Mu'tazilism. He knew how to read classical Arabic texts, particularly in the intellectual tradition. And he, at one point in the mid-1980s, started to read Al-Ghazali, and he came across so many things that were familiar to him from his earlier readings of Ibn Sina. And he also realized that Al-Ghazali did a couple of changes, small changes there. But the changes that and this is one of the conclusions of this book, Creation of the Cosmic System, he writes at the end, the changes that Al-Ghazali actually makes to Ibn Sina are minute and insignificant in comparison to the great degree of teachings that Al-Ghazali actually takes over from Ibn Sina. One particular question was very important here, the question of causality, causal change. Ibn Sina has defended a position that goes back to Aristotle, which basically says, in this case, all the things in this world have natures in them. And these natures, this is a little bit used different. The word nature is differently used from how we use it today. We talk about the nature, you go into nature, you have a walk in nature, that's a bit different. Here, natures means everything has a nature. So we would say, for instance, it lies in the nature of a fox to eat a goose. If you put a fox and a goose together in a room or in a peg, one thing will happen. The fox will, by its nature, attack the goose and try to eat it. So that's what we mean by nature here. And so each and everything, not only animals, but also stones and clouds and all, have their nature and react in a certain way. So this is what we would think in this case. We would call these laws of physics, laws of nature. They are ingrained in the nature. So the causal reactions that things actually have to one another are the clash. They come through these clashes, and the natures clash, and then things come about. And they come about, as Avicenna and Aristotle, or in a necessary way. When two things come together, for instance, the old example is when fire and cotton come together, cotton will combust no matter what, and that is necessary, according to Aristotle and according to Ibn Sina. We call this idea in this case today, and Frank was the one who coined this usage, we call it secondary causality. Secondary causality is clear. It's secondary because this is all arranged according to Ibn Sina and also Aristotle. This is arranged in this case by a creator God. The creator God is the one who is the ultimate cause of everything. If we, for instance, think about a match as something that ignites the fire on the match ignites cotton, then it is only seen in this case as an intermediary, because it is a causal chain that actually goes back until it actually is created by God. So that's the position of Ibn Sina. Opposed to that was a cosmology that was developed in Islamic theology amongst Ash'arites. And you, of course, know that Al-Ghazali was an Ash'arite, and that's what we call occasionalism. And occasionalism is radically different thinking from that. It assumes in this case there are no causal relations between things in the created world. So an occasionalist would say in this case, it appears only to us that the fire on the match ignites the cotton. In reality, it does not do that. It's just that the two come together, and in that moment of the coming together, God creates immediately, directly, the fire in the cotton, the combustion in the cotton. So the cause of everything in this world, and this is an idea that really goes back to Al-Ash'ari himself. It's based on earlier Mu'tazili's ideas, you know, the story, for instance, of Al-Ash'ari's conversion from Mu'tazilism to Ash'arism, to Sunnism. And Al-Ash'ari said, you know, everything in this world is created directly as each and every occasion, that's how the word actually, by God himself. And God rearranges this world every moment anew. If we have movement, it basically means in this case that, you know, my hand, for instance, is created in steps further away. And in fact, even with human actions, even they need to be created by God. That's a different set of problems in this case that we can't go in there. So occasionalism means in this case, there is no causal connection. And Al-Ghazali, of course, being an Ash'ari, being trained in Ash'arism, he grew up with the cosmology of occasionalism. What Richard and Frank then actually proposed was, if you read him closely, you see that he used a lot of language of occasionalism, but in reality, he does not actually believe in occasionalism. Now, you might actually say, you know, how do we know? What's the difference in the first place? Of course, these are two theories, you know, theories. How can they, you know, how would we even know that God either creates directly in an occasionalist way, or he uses the model that Avicenna and Aristotle had actually devised? And there was a significant dispute, and namely in this case, this is the prophetic miracle, which according to Ash'ari need to be there. So let's not forget in this case, revealed religion is based on prophets, on the revelation that comes from God. So immensely important to identify a prophet from somebody who pretends to be a prophet, a mutanabbi. So the Nabi, in this case, you really want to be certain who is the Nabi, as opposed to the mutanabbi, because that's you know, that's what most religious disputes are about. Christianity, Judaism, Islam dispute the fact in this case that certain people are, according to Christianity, for instance, not prophets. So they say in this case, Muhammad is not a prophet. So you need to be certain about that. Ash'arites had come to the conclusion, again, based on early Mu'tazilite ideas, that it's the prophetical miracle that confirms a prophet. Al-Juwayni, for instance, the teacher of Al-Ghazali, has a very elaborate and very precise idea that the prophet has to actually issue a challenge, a tahaddi, and it must be clear in this case that amongst his audience, nobody is able to fulfill the task that he challenges him to do other than he himself. In the case of Muhammad, that is, of course, you know, and we have this tahaddi in the Quran that he actually, Muhammad himself says, you know, why don't you create something like the Quran? And nobody is able to do that. Muhammad is able to create the Quran. It is regarded as the miracle that confirms his prophecy. And a miracle, and that is something very important here, is considered to be a break in, we would say, the laws of nature. Humans are by their nature able to create literature, but not of the kind of the Quran, not of the quality of the Quran. That lies outside of the ability of any human other than Muhammad. And Muhammad is only able to create it because God has given him the extra ability in this case to do that. So this is important. Now, what Richard and Frank then said was, Al-Ghazali no longer believes in this. he has actually sided with Avicenna, and he would say in this case, everything goes by natures, everything goes by causal processes. And opposed to him stood up his colleague, Michael Mamura, and he says, no. If you read Al-Ghazali closely, you actually see that he remains an occasionalist. And although it is true that he sometimes uses the language of Avicenna, he uses the language of Avicenna in a way, in this case, that to express his occasionalist ideas. So that was the impasse in which I more or less grew as a graduate student when I became interested in Richard and Frank. This really impasse, both of them were putting out, at times they were putting out the same texts by Al-Ghazali, translating them slightly different to say in this case, but look here, Al-Ghazali is actually a follower of Ibn Sina in what we call cosmology. And then somebody will, no, here he is evidently in this case here is an occasionalist. And it's true. And I started working on this, and this was the motivation, long time, and I have 5 more minutes, which I will talk about. This was the motivation when I started working on this. I had already worked on Al-Ghazali's Tahafut, particularly the last page, the condemnation of philosophy. I was very interested what kind of ideas are behind it, how Islamic thinking, how Islamic legal thinking arrived at a position that it would actually say, a group of people are no longer Muslims. I was very interested in that. But now I wanted to get back, in this case, to this problem that existed between Richard and Frank and Michael Mamura. And I looked into one particular source, and that was more or less my solution to it, that was very important for this debate. Yet, however, none of the two authors, neither Frank nor Mamura, had really engaged closely with. And so I realized this, and this is from the Tahafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali's work, where he argues against Avicenna, the famous or infamous 17th discussion. It is about causality. It starts basically with an initial sentence that says, in this case, when two things come together, and it appears to us that there is a causal connection, then Al-Ghazali says, then that connection is not necessary according to us. Now, it's always been read, this sentence, to mean, in this case, the whole 17th discussion has been read, in this case, always as a defense of occasionalism against Avicenna's view of secondary causality. And maybe that is the reason why Richard and Frank never dared to touch it, because he probably might have suspected that it does not vindicate his view of Al-Ghazali. Now, I did the same thing that Richard and Frank and Michael Mamura did, meaning in this case, reading Al-Ghazali very, very closely. And if you read him closely, you actually realize that his language is very subtle. Two things come together, and there is a connection, and he does use the word connection, iqtiran, between these two things. But the connection is not necessary according to us. And I don't want to take away fun from reading this. I recommend you might read the book, in particular my analysis of this sentence. And I've come to conclude in this case that, he says something very subtle here. He simply says, okay, so two things come together. He actually does leave it open whether there is a causal connection. There is a connection, but the connection could be one, in this case, of before and after. But he says, in this case, it is not necessary to us. And then I was also looking into what does necessary actually mean for Avicenna? What does it mean for Al-Ghazali? And I came to conclude in this case that when he says necessary to us, then basically what he simply says there is that according to us, the connection could be different. Now, what does this mean? That means in this case that if we have fire that touches cotton and leads to combustion of cotton, then what he basically says there, according to us, this could be different. Meaning simply that the laws of nature, the laws of physics, he argues, could be different. That is what he really says in the first sentence. When you actually hear me saying, in this case, you might say, well, it's a far-fetched interpretation, but I make the case in my book, and by and large, so far the field has followed me on this. So what he's really saying there is what he objects to in Avicenna is his so-called necessitarianism. And what do we mean by that is, of course, Avicenna believes there is a creator God. However, he does not believe that this creator God could have created a world any other than the one that we live in. He can only create one. So in a sense, you might say, you know, his idea of a creator God is very different. And that is what Al-Ghazali has argued, very different from the God that speaks to us in the Quran. The God that speaks to us in the Quran is somebody who makes choices, who decides, who creates amongst, as we say, amongst alternatives. And that's basically what Al-Ghazali maintains here against Ibn Sina. He says in this case, this world could be different if God had wanted it to be different. And an Avicennist, a student of Avicenna, a follower of Avicenna would say, no, sorry, that's not the case. The laws of nature are fixed. God is, you could say, the laws of nature. That's more or less the ultimate position that Avicenna actually holds. You know, he holds the God of the philosopher is not somebody, in this case, it's, you know, who could do anything, could do anything, in the way, in this case, you know, other than emanating the world. It's just, you would say, a creation automaton. And Al-Ghazali says, no, Avicenna, you're wrong on that. Here are my arguments for why it is not necessary. And then it goes on. And my conclusion at the end was, and I should say, is that for what Al-Ghazali in fact does, and this was my kind of attempted resolution between the two positions of Richard and Frank and Imran. I should say in this case that although it sounds a little bit that if I sided entirely with Richard and Frank, I did not. I sided with Michael Marmora. In the sense that I would point out, yes, there are lots of texts by Al-Ghazali where he talks and writes as an occasionalist. Most importantly, his Iqtisad fil i'tiqad is an occasionalist text. The second book in the Ihya Ulumuddin is an occasionalist text. There are several works in this case, which really, you know, where he writes in the classical tradition of Asharite cosmology. But however, there are also lots of texts where he writes like Ibn Sina. Most importantly, the 35th book of Ihya Ulumuddin. So very interesting. Even in the Ihya Ulumuddin, you have books that are distinctly occasionalist and others that are distinctly, you would say, Avicenna. And what does it mean to me? And this is an important suggestion that has implications for the whole Islamic tradition, is that Al-Ghazali was basically undecided about the question of how God creates. He actually says, you know, how will we know? Okay, so we would say in this case, you know, is there anything in the natural sciences that would tell us, that would answer this question? He would say no. Is there anything in Revelation that would answer this question? He would say no. Is there anything in philosophy that could answer this question? And again, he goes into that and he says no. God has chosen not to give us knowledge about this. And one important element there is Al-Ghazali's teachings about the prophetic miracle, where he actually says, well, the prophetic miracle does exist, yes, but it is not a break with the laws of nature. He would basically say, you know, this is, you know, whatever a prophetical miracle is something in this case that is produced within the laws of nature. Sometimes laws of nature that might not be known to us. He discusses the very important example of Ibrahim standing in front of Pharaoh, throwing his stick, turns into a serpent, picks it up, it's a stick again. He discusses this, he suggests how laws of nature do actually create this. There is a theory in this case that we would today call, you know, a catalyst, something in this case makes known chemical reactions to speed up in very rapid ways. So but he would say in this case, so given the fact that there is no break of the laws of nature, there's no way how we would know whether it is the occasionalist model that God applies or the one of Avicenna. And he would say in this case, this is simply something that God doesn't think it's necessary for us to really know. in terms of epistemology, it's very interesting because it leaves Al-Ghazali in an agnostic position about this, which he did not openly acknowledge, which then led to the conflict between Richard and Frank and Maimura. There's no, unfortunately, in this case, he didn't say in this case what he really thought about this, because also he lost interest in this problem. This was not something in this case that really burned under his fingernails. I can write about the world as if it is occasionalist, as if I am an occasionalist. And I can write about somebody as if I believe in the laws of nature. And most importantly, it also shows in this case that, okay, as an occasionalist, you can totally engage in the natural sciences. It's another, I would say, conclusion from my book, which I've also developed since. In this case, before there was the idea, sometimes it still lingers around in some circles of the world, that if you are an occasionalist, an Asharite, in this case, you do not believe in the conduct of the natural sciences because everything is just randomly going on. There are no real laws of nature. Wrong. Even Asharites believe in laws of nature. They might not call it that, but they call it God's habit. And we actually see also, occasionalism is not at all dead after Al-Ghazali. It has its life in kicking. And many important works in the later Asharite tradition are written in an occasionalist way. But they still say in this case, we're still interested in the laws of nature as God's habits, which they might argue, which could be broken. And Al-Ghazali says also, yes, God is able to break his habit. But Al-Ghazali actually says he never does it. He doesn't need to. And that's as long as that's where I will stop and give you a chance in this case to talk about and ask questions. Before I do that, however, quickly just say what I also did. So the book actually eventually, when you look at it, is actually has two parts. One part is about Al-Ghazali's life. And I also have, and in this first part, I also have something interesting which I became interested in this case. I wrote about Al-Ghazali's immediate students. Now, why did I do that? Because I realized in this case that Al-Ghazali himself is a difficult author. He's hard to read. He's difficult to understand. And it might help us to understand him if we read his students. If we look at what his students actually tell us about what he taught. And that was actually a successful way. I looked particularly at Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who was a very fertile source in this respect. And I also looked at Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, for instance. And I should say in this case that this is more or less, this particular chapter in this case on the students led me to what I did in my book right now, in my most recent book, which I might talk about in a minute. But I should say in this case, so what I also, in a sense, I should say, I'm a little bit proud about, is to really have based the biography of Al-Ghazali on a proper source study and used, most importantly, also Persian sources, which had not been used before. It's interesting in this case that when I actually studied, when I started Islamic studies, I never did Persian. I did Turkish then. There was a second language requirement and I fulfilled it with Turkish. But for this book, just to write this book, in the year 2000, after I'd done my dissertation, which was published in that year, I actually started learning Persian just to work with Persian sources and establish a full biography of Al-Ghazali that is entirely based on sources, which has a couple of things that turned out to be surprising. I revised his year of birth and a couple of things in this case that were out there, whether, people say in this case he roamed around for 10 years as a Sufi traveler. And I hope I ended that rumor and said in this case, no, he was really always teaching at a madrasa. The only question for him was what type of madrasa he was teaching at. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your very enlightening talk. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll open it up to questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free to write the questions down. Mizan and myself will pick them up. But I'll start.
So Imran, you start off with the questions and I'll
I'll start with a few questions now. So Professor,
Imran, you're mute now. for one reason or the other. You turned out to be mute.
Unmute, sorry. I think that's automatic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can hear me now.
Apologies. So obviously you've discussed the background in terms of the discussion about a 17-point in the tahafut between Frank and Mamura, and then you've got some like Abdul Hamid Sabra, who talks about naturalization and appropriation, that Ghazali naturalized and appropriated. I was wondering, to what extent do you feel Ghazali, when he appropriated from Avicenna, took things that were qatiyat or burhani things, or like the discussion about causality, necessary causality or secondary causality, occasionism? You say Ghazali wasn't able to come to a solid answer because he didn't have a burhani proof or an apodictic proof. So to what extent was the naturalization on secondary matters where Ghazali had the scope, in a sense, and to what extent did he take on those matters that he may have made takfir of the the philosopher? Did he actually harmonize those kind of issues, or was it clearly on qati, zanni, burhani, non-burhani issues? If you could elaborate on that.
Thanks, Imran. It's a very rich question, and I could talk another half hour about it. So I try to make it brief. Yes. Now, in my earlier work, this was actually my master thesis, where I worked on Faisal al-Tafriqa. I had already come across this phrase "Qanun al-Ta'wil," which Al-Ghazali uses in that particular book, and then there is a short text. It's called, it circulates as Al-Qanun al-Kulli fi Ta'wil. I've become interested in it, and find out what does Al-Ghazali actually mean. And it's not easy. Faisal al-Tafriqa is not an easy work. It works with certain levels of existence, and it's hard to make out what's really going on there. But eventually, what it really argues for is the following. It says, when you actually look at the Quran and you doubt that the zahir of the Quran, the outward meaning, is correct or not, and of course, examples where an Ash'ari even would argue is, istawa ala al-arsh. So he sits upright on the throne. Does he have a body? I mean, how can this be? Is this really valid on the zahir? Then Al-Ghazali actually says, there is a simple rule to apply here. You have to look at whether the zahir violates what is known, and here comes the phrase an burhan, by virtue of demonstration, or we would call apodictically, because an burhan, the phrase, comes straight out of the philosophical movement. It's a good illustration in this case how Al-Ghazali engages with the philosophical translation. I mean, and it comes, it's basically a translation of a phrase that already appears in Aristotle. But that was you would say that the group of scholars surrounding Michael Mamura would have thought it's well known that Al-Ghazali engages in the logic of Aristotle and that he's impressed by the logic. But it really means in this case that, and this is, you can't just simply, if you actually look into Aristotelianism doesn't make a difference between logic and ontology. Those things belong together. The moment you actually apply Aristotelian logic, you apply an Aristotelian worldview. And that's what happened here in this case. What it meant in this case means, if you can actually prove something beyond doubt, if you have a demonstration, if you have a logical demonstration, now today in this case, we totally think different about what a demonstration is and where it could be possible. We basically say the only place where it's possible is the mathematics. But in those days, the natural sciences were dominated by demonstrations, so-called demonstrations. And even, and this is a claim by Ibn Sina, and even metaphysics. So Avicenna claimed, what I know about God, the fact in this case that he is necessity, that he is a self-necessitating principle, I know an burhan. And here Al-Ghazali actually kicks in and says in this case, no, you don't. He examined the arguments of Ibn Sina and said in this case, when it comes to metaphysics, they are actually not demonstrative, which also means in this case that lots of arguments lots of places in the Quran where Avicenna engages in ta'wil, in an allegorical reading, Al-Ghazali would say, no, you can't do this, because the so-called burhan that you have falls apart. It's not a burhan. So what we see then, and I'm not sure in this case whether I gave a good answer to your question, is that Al-Ghazali has, a systematic view, where in this case, his rule of interpretation really dovetails with what he does in the Tahafut. It dovetails also with later on. And you're absolutely right to say this. When it comes to cosmology, the first insight that Al-Ghazali has is that there is no demonstration either way. So, you might talk about indications, but even those are feeble. There is just so demonstration for Al-Ghazali is a way how God gives us certain knowledge in the sciences, certain knowledge on the world, about his creation, but there is no certain knowledge that God has given us about himself, about his attributes, about the way he creates, and other things. That's what Al-Ghazali actually believed. Although Al-Ghazali he did actually believe that God gave us certain knowledge about the fact that this world was created in time. And that has implications as well. So meaning in this case, Al-Ghazali, according to Al-Ghazali, God gave us certain knowledge about the fact that he makes choices, that he exercises, we call it ikhtiyar, that he chooses this creation among possible other alternatives. There, Al-Ghazali actually believed that is something that God has given us certain knowledge about, in opposition to Avicenna. And we should also say in this case that's something in this case that later scholars actually did not accept. Later scholars there, but we can talk about that maybe.
Thank you for that. I was just, so in effect, are you saying that what Ghazali took from Avicenna, appropriated, so naturalism appropriated, were issues that could be taken from an Ash'ari because in a way they weren't definitive evidence against it, so they therefore can be harmonized with the school, whereas something like the eternity of the universe or bodily resurrection, I forget the third one now, just off the head, knowledge of particulars, these were foundational issues that Ghazali couldn't accept, and he was an Avasanian in those sense.
Right, so that's right. That's precisely right to put it. So at the end, and this is also something that I took from reading the Faisal al-Tafriqa, when it comes to where Al-Ghazali says, here are the borders of Islam, like everybody who works in dogmatics, it was almost arbitrary. You'd say this is just too far. You would say in this case, thinking in this case that the world is eternal has the implication that God is self-necessitating, and that's just, as a Muslim, we don't do that. And he uses a phrase for that in his Faisal al-Tafriqa. He calls usul al-aqaid, the principles of dogmatics, or however you want to put this. And he basically says this is where it ends. So he basically says, everybody else is within the fold of Islam, is protected by Islamic law. But if you do that, too far. And as I said, like everybody who works in dogma, and that's rare in Islam, by the way. It doesn't happen all too often that Muslims basically say, this is too far, that they think about the borders. It's today in more modern context, in this case, even Muslims do that more often, but in pre-modern Islam, that's actually not happening all too often. But Al-Ghazali was one of those. The one thing, and quickly I only touch on something that you suggested. Does Al-Ghazali accept only those things from Ibn Sina where he thought Ibn Sina produces a burhan, a valid burhan? And you might say in this case, actually, that's also not true. Sure, every point where Al-Ghazali thought that Ibn Sina produces a valid burhan, he must accept, because that is his principle, a burhan, and that is what I pointed out on various of my publications. If Al-Ghazali says a burhan, this is a successful burhan, he says hands down, we must accept it. Every human must accept it. It's almost part of the fitrah, the ability in this case that we accept those things and for instance, the existence of God is for Al-Ghazali something that is created, un-burhan. The fact that God doesn't have a body is something that is proven un-burhan, which is why he engages in ta'wil when it comes to the so-called anthropomorphic verses, and so on. But there's also, and there, of course, in those issues, he agrees with Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina says those same things. But he goes further. So for instance, one of the most fertile fields where Avicenna and later Ash'arites adapt Ibn Sina is psychology, the teachings about the soul, which before Al-Ghazali were totally different in the Ash'arite school than after Al-Ghazali. And what makes the difference here is basically Avicenna's, I would almost say, not almost, I say, scientific explanation of prophecy. Avicenna gave an explanation for prophecy that according to the scientific rules of the time were absolutely scientific convincing. So whereas today, after Kant, we basically say, prophecy or not, it's not something that we do in the sciences, right? We don't prove in the sciences whether somebody is a prophet. We can't even prove in the sciences whether prophecy exists in principle. So there is a certain distinction there, and this comes out of, you would say, European Enlightenment. In this pre-Enlightenment days, Avicenna would say prophecy is something that can be proven to exist in the sciences, and it is it has to do with the human soul. It is certain faculties of the human soul. He writes about it in detail, and Al-Ghazali adapts this wholeheartedly. In fact, in his autobiography on Munqidh min ad-Dalal, in the passage that is also not easy to read, and you have to basically roll around every word there, but he says very clearly in this case, for 10 years I was wondering whether Avicenna was right about this, and now I've come to conclude, yes, he's right about it. I do accept Avicenna's view on the soul, and I do Avicenna's views on prophecy.
Thank you. So basically, he appropriated those things that he felt were, Avicenna had either Burhan or not Burhan, or nevertheless was the best optimum theory out there. So what does that say about the Ash'ari school in terms of its flexibility and flexibility and its rigidness?
Right. I would say what he mostly adapted are those positions, those fields where, in a sense, Ash'arism hadn't developed a particular view.
Mm.
So for instance, this thing about prophecy, Ash'arites had never written about how prophecy came about, or when, then they did so in a very vague way. So what Al-Ghazali, and that's actually what I argued in 2004 article that is largely based on my master thesis, which I wrote almost 10 years before, basically saying this, what's happening here, he basically fills out voids. So there are in Ash'ari theory certain voids about how to think about prophecy. And he fills them up with Avicennan theories and Avicennan ideas. That's what he does in prophecy. In a sense, you can also say the same thing in this case with occasionalism. And he says in this case, occasionalism, he basically says, it's just one way to explain God's creative activity. And he kind of fills up the other way, the alternative way, with Avicenna. And he nowhere says that there might not even be a third possibility to explain how God creates the world. But it's very interesting that there, of course, in order to do that, he kind of has to radically put forward an epistemology that allows him to have more than one parallel explanation, and to apply that in his works. And that is, and I would also say, this was my key insight then, that this exists in the Islamic tradition. That an author would basically say, I don't know, Allahu Alam, and writes it this way and writes it that way. And that was confusing to Western readers in a very, very profound way. It confused Marmora, it confused Richard and Frank. They could not believe that that would be possible. And I think if I would like to point out an accomplishment, if I may use that way, or my intervention in that book is to say in this case, here's something happening in the Islamic tradition, in the Islamic philosophy and theological tradition, that we as Western readers are unfamiliar with and gotta get used to that. And it also means in this case that there is a significant more flexibility in the philosophical and theological literature of Islam, which we do not see in Western context. And ultimately that has to do with central authority. It has to do with the non-existence of a church, of a pope, of somebody who sits down and sets dogma. The fact in this case that Islam is much more flexible in this way led to different ways in terms of its intellectual history.
Thank you for that. Brilliant. I'm just going to ask one more question, and we'll open it to the participants. Now, this obviously maybe links to your new book, but as well as the Madnoon corpus, which I know Dr. Afifi Rakiti in Oxford was working on for his PhD. Sadly, nothing's come up apart from maybe an article or so. But I know when I looked at your content page for your forthcoming book, the formation of post-classical philosophy in Islam, that you've got a section on it. So I was wondering, how do you engage with the Madnoon corpus, and what does it tell you about Ghazalian thought? Because Dr. Afifi Rakiti was saying that this is going to be revolutionary in terms of our understanding of Ghazalian thought. Where do you stand in terms of your engagement of that, and how does that maybe, in a way, corroborate your findings in your previous work, or in a way change it? How do you see the Madnoon corpus as a game changer?
Right. So this does actually, I do this in my forthcoming book, which inshallah shall come out this summer, and that is basically, it doesn't number. It's a huge book. It has 650 pages. I do a lot of things there. One of the things that I do is I look into Al-Ghazali's reception, the reception of Al-Ghazali's ideas. So it's again in this case, I was at the end, ultimately, I was uncertain. What is my reading right about Al-Ghazali? And so I was looking into his readers, and the century, this book is about the century after Al-Ghazali. It's about the 12th century. It deals with Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi a lot. It deals with Fakhruddin Razi a lot, and points out wherever they engage with, where they take over ideas of Al-Ghazali. I see that a lot in Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi, for instance, which has so far not been mentioned in the literature. And Fakhruddin Razi as well, but then they also do their own thing in this case, where they really say, no, Al-Ghazali was wrong about this. So I was very interested in that. And of course, sooner or later, you touch on the Madnoon corpus, and I should say right away that Afifi and I are good friends. We know each other from our days as graduate students. We were graduate students simultaneously working on similar things, or actually not graduate student. I was an assistant professor, and he was at Oxford. And I was very interested in his dissertation. I engaged with him closely, and I was always waiting for him to publish, which he did, as you say, in one article that came out in a collective volume, but he never put forward his full views, namely that the so-called Madnoon corpus, which are a number of texts out there, overall these are about 4 or 5 different, somehow similar texts, somehow different. They all have in its title Al-Madnoon Bihi or Al-Madnoon Biha, and meaning in this case, the texts that should be kept back from those who are not fit to engage, who are not fit to read them. And he says in this case, this is a whole kind of, we would say, an esoteric corpus of Al-Ghazali, where he puts down his real opinion about matters in philosophy and matters in theology. And these real opinions, if we look at them, at least some of these books, turn out to be precisely the same ideas as Avicenna's. So that is very interesting, including tacit acknowledgement that the world is not created in time, meaning eternal, and that therefore God must be self-necessitating. And so it's problematic. And I've long hesitated to engage with it because I wanted Afifi to give the chance to present his views and make the case for that. But in the course of my book, it became necessary to really look at that from this corpus from I would say neutral angle. Look at Afifi's ideas, which he presented in this dissertation, which I had a copy of, accessible to me, made by Yahya Michaud, my good colleague. And I look at that, and I look at the text, and I come to a different assessment in the way, in this case, that's complicated. What basically happened is that all the books that bear the title Al-Madnoon Biha al-Ghayri, or Kutub Al-Madnoon Biha al-Ghayri Ahliha, they are all, I would say, created after the death of Al-Ghazali as books. But some of them are based on genuine Ghazalian texts. Some of them are really, I would say, genuine. There might have been letters, there might have been things that Al-Ghazali left at his khanqa, at his death, that were turned into books. And given this title, there are reasons why this title is attractive to students of Al-Ghazali, which I point out. And yet there are also 2 texts that unfortunately I come to conclude they are forgeries. constructed in a similar way. So you would actually say, the forger used a strategy that I would say genuine students of Al-Ghazali have used to put out text, put out text in this case that turn Al-Ghazali into 100% Avicennian, or you might say a 99% Avicennian, because that's the view they had of Al-Ghazali. So it's very interesting. There was a readership out there, and that's what I write about it. You might say, the conflict between Richard M. Frank and Michael Marmora existed amongst the generation of his students. Some of them said, in this case, well, he's an Asharite. And others said, and whether they were students of his or people who came from outside, no, he is an Avicennian, 100% Avicennian. Now, they didn't write articles, they didn't use footnotes, they didn't write books the way we write it. They produce evidence that today is accessible to us only through manuscripts. And of course, Afifi has done tremendously valuable work to discover these manuscripts, to produce the text in this case in this manuscript, which I rely heavily on, and I'm the first to acknowledge his great achievement on that. Yet when it comes to the conclusions, I have slightly different ones. And Iqbal, you're mute.
Apologies. It's I think there's something on the software keeps on muting me. Brilliant. So we really look forward to reading that particular section and your analysis on the Madnun corpus and Dr. Afifi's work whenever that comes out in the near future. It should obviously be very revolutionary for Ghazalian studies. So I have a few more questions, but what I'll do, I'll take the question from the audience first, the participants, and then we'll come back outside.
Yeah, so we'll start with a question from Safruk had a question. I think he's gone. Right, okay, so we have a question from Asif, I think it is. Just I'm going to unmute you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question is regarding how Imam Ghazali viewed, for example, miracles in the light of science. So can miracle basically, suppose a miracle happens in a physical world, does the implication of the miracle also have some effect on the physical world, and is it universal in the sense, suppose there is a miracle of moon splitting, does the physical effect of a splitting of a physical object called moon has a actual bearing on how the moon gets restructured, and does it get, since there is a law of optics, does it get viewed by universally by all people who can view it and record it?
Okay. Yes, so I have a chapter on that. It's not very long chapter. It's only 5 pages in my book because it's very simple to explain. So earlier scholars such as Juwayni, his teacher, who is in this case a traditional Ashuist, said in this case, that the prophetical miracle, the mu'jiza, and if you translate mu'jiza, it doesn't translate as miracle, it translates as something that people are unable to do. Meaning in this case, there's only one person who's able to do, the prophet in this case. So there's the root ajaz is in there, which basically means inability. So, but the prophetical miracle is something in this case, according to Juwayni, in this case, that breaks the laws of nature. Kharak al-ada, in this case. The laws of nature here are understood as God's habits. Al-Ghazali revisits this in the light of the 17th, as a result of his discussion in the 17th chapter of Tahafut al-Falasifa. He comes to the conclusion in this case, God could in principle break his habit. But for reasons that have to do with natural science and with Al-Ghazali's view of God, he says in this, God never does. And he goes to the Quran and he quotes the Quran. There are a couple of verses that say, La tabdila fi sunnat Allah. So there is no change in God's habits. And that means for him, the laws of nature are actually never broken when humans witness a prophetical miracle. what we are rather dealing with, and I use the word in this case, it's not a miracle, strictly speaking. It's more, we would say in this case, a marvel. It's a rare event. A rare event, however, that is explicable with the existing laws of nature. Al-Ghazali only discusses one real miracle here. I mean, other than the Quran. I mean, probably the Quran is the second one he also discusses, but the one he really discusses in the course of the 17th discussion of Tahafut is the miracle I've already alluded to, Ibrahim standing in front of the Pharaoh, in front of Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's sorcerers, throwing down the stick, the wooden stick, turning into a serpent. Everybody sees the serpent, picking it up again, it's being a stick again. And there he gives an explanation that according to his understanding of the natural sciences is a solid explanation possible. He says possible. He doesn't say that it is the case. It's a possible explanation in terms of the natural sciences. Now, when it comes to, so you mentioned in this case, the splitting of the moon. He never touches on this. But it is clear on several occasions, actually, when he talks about these kind of events, and he says in this case, you know, people are easily fooled. Al-Ghazali was extremely interested in false sense perception, we might say. So he talks about how people, for instance, you know, at a campfire, sit together, and somebody takes a piece of coal and creates circles, creates lines, writes something into the air. That is something that he was very interested in. The fact in this case, he mentions several times, you know, you put your finger to your eyeball, you see two moons. Meaning in this case, he was very interested in anything that has to do with epistemology. He was very interested in sense perception, in the fallacies of sense perception. And when it comes in this case to the splitting of the moon, and you would press him, if we had him here right now, I think he would go into that direction. But that's all I say in this case. He's very clear about the fact that there is no break ever of the laws of nature, basically since the first day of creation. Since the first day of creation, the laws of nature, the laws of physics are the one, and we are able to discover them. And that's what he promotes also. He is a promoter of the sciences and the natural sciences.
Brilliant. So I've got a few questions in private, Professor. I'm just quickly going to go through. So the first one is by Amir, which is talking about a decline thesis, which is if you are an Ashri, you cannot believe in science. I'm not sure if this is what I heard. If this is the case, then how can tajri by experimentation, i.e. accumulation of experience, be a source of ilm amongst the Ashara? So would you like to take that one first?
I totally agree. So, however, let me just, maybe you haven't heard about it, but I tell you there are lots of people out there, or were out there, no, they're still out there who say in this case that Asharite occasionalism and science are totally opposed to one another. If you're interested, go to YouTube, put in the word Neil deGrasse Tyson. You get a couple of very interesting polemics, anti-Asharite polemics. Not only anti-Asharite, these are anti-Islamic. So there are lots of people out there, and Neil deGrasse Tyson is a big name in the teaching of modern sciences, and others are Steven Weinberg, who got a Nobel Prize, also has engaged in anti-Ghazalian, anti-Asharite polemic that you know, if you are an Asharite, you never you know, you'll never be able to engage fully in the sciences, which explains why since then and here we come to the Decline Thesis, there haven't been many discoveries made by Muslims. And I think Steven Weinberg also makes the case in this case that only a few Muslims have ever gotten the Nobel Prize. Now there you got really a great argument, right? So there are people out there who say that. I have always argued against it precisely with the kind of argument that I think I hear you making, namely in this case that, okay, you talk about Adatullah, and the Mu'tazilites already talk about that. But what you mean is precisely this, laws of nature. And Kharak al-Ada points out in this case that for the Asharites, God has chosen these laws. For an Avicennian, for an Aristotelian, God doesn't choose these laws. You might actually say, almost as I indicated before, God is these laws. That's an Asharite, that's an Avicennan, and particular Avicennan understanding of the deity. That, you know, when we talk about God, we really mean the conglomerate of the laws of nature. I totally agree, and tajriba is Al-Ghazali's way in this case to establish, call it laws of nature, call it adat Allah, but to find out how nature works. And he had as I pointed out, his idea is that nature is stable. There's no fuzziness here. And if he says in this case that it's not necessary, then he only means in this case, you know, could it be a different nature? Could it be a different nature, but it is this one that God has chosen. And we also know, and this is something that I might just point out here as a footnote in this case, that in the 35th book of his Ihya Ulumuddin, he says in this case, you know, it is this nature, these laws of nature that God has chosen. And according to Al-Ghazali, these are the best possible laws of nature. This is the best of the possible, the best of all words that God actually could have created.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So I've got just two more questions in terms of that have been sent to me directly. So one is about the relationship between Ghazali and Juwayni, and it is asking, does the view that Ghazali's theology was genuinely derived from his teacher Juwayni's works and hence unoriginal hold any credence?
There's absolutely no question. When we talk about originality in the Islamic tradition, Al-Ghazali is on top of that list. Of course, he was heavily influenced by Al-Juwayni. Of course, there are certain issues where he goes entirely with Al-Juwayni, particularly in Islamic law. However, he is extremely independent in several issues, as I pointed out, occasionally. Juwayni was 100% occasionalist. He had no patience with Avicenna's views of causal change and secondary causality. Just to go out and say in this case, you know, could be true, you know, we don't really know. That is extremely, extremely original. Al-Ghazali has on this front, right from the beginning of his discovery by the West, which happened in the 19th century, compared to Kant, who struggled with similar questions, gave different kind of answers, but also came to the conclusion, did the same kind of thorough epistemological inquiry and concluded in this case, you know, Kant basically said whether causality is out there in the, you know, Ding an sich, in the things as they are, we don't know. It's but what we can say in this case, it's a category of our thinking. We just cannot think but in terms of causality. And I see Al-Ghazali almost making a very, very similar move here.
Another question by Rizwan is, how significant was Ghazali as compared to Razi with respect to the reception of Avasanianism in Ashuism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I argue, and I've been on record for that I say Al-Ghazali is the one who opens the floodgates. However, there's also a lot of ambiguity in Al-Ghazali towards Avicenna. Just point out the last page of the Tahafut, where, you know, he basically says, if Avicenna were standing right in front of me, I would pull out the dagger and kill him. And he does. I mean, it's not just, you know, it's not just the word. I mean, he does use these words. He says in this case, you know, these people are dangerous for, it's a different subject in this case, for political reasons. That's how Al-Ghazali thinks about that. They undermine social order. And he does, he never quotes Ibn Sina, not in his widely published works. There is one work which I'm certain Al-Ghazali wrote, but he held it back. He did not publish it. It now exists in a single copy at the British Library, in a single manuscript copy. But in his published works, he never ever quotes Ibn Sina. He never says, this is what Ibn Sina says, and then starts a quotation. Fakhruddin Razi is a century later. By this point in time, in this case, to use a phrase that Yahya Mishor has right there, you know, there's a the flood of Avicenianism has moved into the madrasas. Madrasa students were reading Avicenna, whether Al-Ghazali wanted that or not. He did not want them to do that. He wanted rather that he, like the likes of him, would explain to the students what Avicenna meant. But of course, madrasas started, they have books, students definitely in this case started to engage directly with Avicenna. That's happening to the time of Fakhruddin Razi. And what Fakhruddin Razi actually does is much more detailed. You know, he writes a Sharh al-Isharat, means in this case he engages closely with Avicenna's texts, with his words, with his teachings. And he does something very different from Al-Ghazali. His position towards Avicennism is still, I would say, ambiguous. And for me, ambiguity is a very important phrase and category when I read this intellectual tradition. But he is not violent in the way that Al-Ghazali was. You know, his fatwa was violent, is violent. The text is violent, and its implications are even more violent. Fakhruddin Razi has no interest in that anymore. That is, he never condemns the philosopher in a legal way. He only says, well, if you are, you know, he agrees in this case, you know, if you are full Avicennian, you're actually not a Muslim, you're not counted as a Muslim, but for him that has no implication. He himself, we should also say, writes in a way as if he is an Avicennian. So for him, this is a thought experiment, a very important thought experiment, which he engages in actively. And that is totally different from what Al-Ghazali does. Al-Ghazali is as an author, I would still count him amongst the authors of the classical period of Islam, which are characterized by the expectation that an author puts forward one position, one coherent view that he cannot be identified with. Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Al-Ash'ari, all these people, you ask them, what did you teach? You can make a list. This is what they taught. When you actually go to post-classical authors, and Fakhruddin Razi is, in my opinion, the very first example of that, then you actually says, well, in these kind of books, he argues for those sets of teachings. And in another set of books, he argues for a different set of teachings. And if you look at these different sets of teachings, you actually find direct contradictions in between the two. It's a totally different situation. But that is the situation, I think, that characterizes what I call post-classical philosophy in Islam. And as I say, Fakhruddin Razi is the first one who starts writing like this around 1200. And that's definitely going on for the next 3-4 centuries. So Fakhruddin Razi is an extremely important author of that period. Which has different rules of engagement with ideas, which made it absolutely difficult, if not impossible, for Western readers of the 19th century to appreciate it. I think we're now in a different position, and we can actually say that, you know, Al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin Razi, in their own ways, find answers to very fundamental philosophical and theological problems and questions that we can appreciate in equal way, and both of them have their own very significant influence on the Islamic tradition.
Thank you for that. So I just got 2 questions. We'll wrap it up with 2 questions. The first one I have is, obviously you've been an authority now in terms of Islamic theology and philosophy and Ghazalian studies, and we're very fortunate to have lots of people coming on who are either graduate students, postgraduate students doing PhDs, or early, fellows and so on and so forth. In your view, what are the areas in Islamic theology and philosophy that require some serious and sustained research in the future? And then in particular, Ghazalian study, where are the gaps that researchers can go in and really flesh out the story further as such? Right.
Almost everywhere where you put your finger, you can do much work, more thorough than existed. More now. First of all, we should, everybody who, the moment we talk about Islamic intellectual traditions, we talk about an ocean. now that stuff is digitalized and texts are digitalized, there is a comparison that I heard recently from somebody who's engaged in this, says in this case, if you compare the texts, the number of texts, the number of words, so that is preserved from all of antiquity, and here antiquity, Greek literature, Latin literature, all the greats of Latin, you have, Cicero and Virgil and all of them you put Aristotle on this, you put Plato on this, you put Galen on this, you put all of this together in this case, and you have about less than 1% of the number of words that we assume exist in Arabic literature. There is no comparison here in this case. It's much, much more. Of course, most of these words still exist in manuscripts and still need to be edited, and they will probably never be fully edited. However, so there's a lot of, and we can also say in this case, where are these words? They are in the post-classical tradition. The post-classical tradition is elusive. It's difficult to understand because of the contradictions that we see there. We haven't yet been able to deal with these contradictions. Therefore, we are only starting now to fully understand what's going on there. Once we actually, I think, change our mindset and the expectations we carry towards these texts, I think, it will be extremely fertile. And we have centuries to reread these texts and to understand them. So the post-classical tradition, I think, is the growth area in Islamic intellectual history, no question, I think. However, when you look at Al-Ghazali, who I characterize as maybe the last author of the classical period in Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy, even there is still so much to be done. So his psychology, for instance, the way he adapts and adopts Avicenna is something in this case that need to be worked on. His legal writings are there are new texts that have just been edited about 10 years ago, and there are major texts that exist in this case that haven't yet been edited. All this, I mean, there are so many things in this case that can be done. He's still a very rich author, despite the fact that Western literature now deals with Al-Ghazali for almost 200 years. For, I would say, for many decades, the field has run into directions that are today no longer really interesting. Yet there are so many, as I say, so many, psychology. The Ihya is an unexplored corpus of works. What does he actually do there? He applies Aristotelian virtue ethics in a way that it engages with the traditional fiqh in Islam. It creates its own genre of books that has hardly found any examples in this case later on. So there are so many things I think that where the field of Al-Ghazali studies could benefit from much more attention.
Brilliant. So one last question from me. Obviously, we know your formulation of post-classical philosophy in Islam is coming out in the summer, and we're hoping to get you back on. I know Mizan's very keen for you to come on around that time and do another session with us and really, go into that work and elaborate on it. I was wondering, what are you currently working on now in terms of articles and books that we should be looking forward to in the next year or two? Where are your interests? And if you can maybe elaborate on some of your contemporary interests, because I was very surprised to see years back when you wrote about Salafism and Islam, and you've got those kind of modern. So what are your forthcoming articles and books going to be about?
Right. So actually what I do these days, I talked about it before, I actually read the proofs of my forthcoming book and I do the index, which is very tedious and not very fun work. So that's what I'm doing now. I have, in the past, I have actually put much of my energy into this book, which will inshallah come out in the summer. I've also, basically, so the book comes with a, I would say, rereading of and a very radical idea, which I've just talked about, namely in this case that in the post-classical period, whatever you read, you first have to look at the genre, and then you carry certain expectations to the genre, and I think what is currently not done is that people actually bring different genres together, and they think in this case that authors have a coherent view. So I don't think that that's the case. So I was working on different genres. The latest work that I've done was actually, again, on Fakhruddin Razi and ethics. Al-Ghazali, I just talked about Al-Ghazali and ethics. Al-Ghazali put all his eggs in the ethics basket, or put all the eggs in ethics in the basket of his Ihya Ulumuddin. But that actually has repercussions later on. So Fakhruddin Razi in this case is similar. That's what I was. So I think, for me in this case, I started working with Al-Ghazali, and then the century afterwards was so full of enigmas. I tried to do this. Maybe I go into the further century, and that's actually another thing that I want to do if God extends my ajal. Then I would like to actually write a textbook on Islamic intellectual traditions, both theology and philosophy, that covers Islamic thinking about God, about theology, about philosophy. Basically, from the, usually the starting point is the murder of Uthman and the beginning of the Kharijite movement, up to where we are today. For instance, one of the latest development that I find very interesting is the development of, you would say, some European Islamic theology, as it is, for instance, developed in the new movement, in this case, of Islamic theology, Islamische theologische Studien, that are now established all over universities, for instance, in the German-speaking world, in Austria, in Germany, and even in Switzerland. That would be something that I feel challenged to write. There is no good textbook of Islamic theology, I think, with all reservations to my colleagues who have tried to write it. And that would be something I would be definitely interested in doing one day, inshallah.
Can I just say on behalf of everyone, thank you for your time. It's very, very precious, and it was very enlightening, and we look forward to you coming in the future and talking about your new book as well. Mizan, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Imran, for a wonderful host, and thank you so much, Professor, for a wonderful discussion and some thoughts. Hopefully we'll hope to have you back. Is it in June or July that your book's going to be ready? Around July. That time. July. Okay, so we'll touch base about a month or so. Maybe we could hold another book launch session with you to discuss.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. I should say I enjoyed it tremendously. I thought the level of engagement with my ideas is flattering to me. I was very pleased. One doesn't get often the opportunity to talk in this depth about one's suggestions and ideas, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
No, pleasure's ours, and we're very honored, and thank you. And if folks, please don't hesitate to buy the book. Just Google it, go to Amazon or whichever bookstore there is. You can see that, and we'll send you the link as well. Leave your email address if you're not on our. It is recorded, and we'll post it up online straight away tonight, and we'll send you the link. And we'll send you the link as well, Professor. Thank you so much, folks, and take care. Hope to see you folks again soon. Take care. Salam.
Thank you very much.
Take care.